I want to explore the cost of living, but in reference to the cost associated with us being given as demand centres or the principal product of civilization. And so in turn, rethink cost in reference to what we externalise or a cost that we perhaps maybe do not realise when we practice economising actions and we feel that there's no opportunity cost as such. So this will be a good way to understand that whenever we talk about the cost of living, it's obviously derivative because that presupposes monetization or the principal product of the consumer. So the cost of living, it becomes an issue with the debasement of currency, and so in turn this is a way of addressing the question of credit, but credit, so as a means of exchange, is ultimately subordinate to the credit instrument that you're given as. So you always have to look at the cost of living as a credit instrument that you are to get a wider perspective to what is ultimately the cost that we externalise. So we're taught that the cost of living is an external force that we are beholden to, that ultimately if life, there is a cost associated with our living, then it's something that we have to pay attention to in order to maintain a certain standard of living, we can say. And so if we look at cost of living in reference to that, well, that's the goods and services, and so your procurement or your provisioning for what would be maybe the necessities, so food, shelter and clothing, but then ultimately there's other things, discretionary spending comes into it. So therefore the cost of living maybe can be in reference to subsistence, or depending upon, you know, the way how that you envisage life will determine what would be the cost of maintaining that lifestyle. And so this is where affluenza or affluence becomes the predominant kind of consideration when you're looking at the cost of the maintenance for that lifestyle. But would we think that there is a cost to maintain ourselves as the credit instruments that we're given as? Now, if we don't, well then that just presupposes that we're not really thinking about our lives holistically, and that the consumer is a fait accompli for anything that we do. And so that gives you the nature that if you can't see cost outside the monetary value associated with it, then you're not really looking at cost in reference to your actions or what is foundational. And so as a result of that, you've regent cost to the claim that's made on your life, and ultimately the claim that's made on your life is is one that is totalizes to the exclusion of other ways of being or doing. And so when we're looking at cost, that's the frame of reference. And so we could say the best way that you can look at that is there an opportunity cost to the way how time's given to us? Is there an opportunity cost to our economization? So economization here is that we economize our time independent of the interaction that we have with each other, because we clear time each time we buy. And so if we're clearing time as a means utilized to produce the form of life to sanction credit as a means of exchange, then that means of exchange can be beholden to a power that we obviously don't animate, and that power can erode the purchasing power of our credit in order for that maintenance or subsistence level. And so this is the question: is that if you don't frame it along these lines, then ultimately the cost of living will be already presupposed. And so what you have is that you have a level of a conversation that is not foundational. And so therefore the cost of living as a credit instrument is a completely different conversation that you would have if you start to question the opportunity cost of your economizing actions. And so to economize time, presupposes something that can be manageable. Time is manageable or is a resource deployed. But if it's manageable or if it's a resource, it's in reference to the end, which is obviously transcendent to the one that you sell yourself on. And so even knowing that you might economize your time in reference to what you presuppose, that what is transcended is the consumer that you have to be in order for that to make sense. And so once again, if you don't look at the production process of yourself as a consumer or as a credit instrument, then you'll never be able to look at the cost of your living the cost of living in reference to the way how you produce yourself as the principal product or credit instrument that you're given as. And so we can say, we can look at the cost, we can look at the cost of living, so the cost of living as the credit instrument that you're given as, but look at it from the development of central bank digital currencies and the way how that if you program credit, then ultimately through that it's going to restructure the asset that you are. Because if you are, in that case, if you are always a demand center, well, if you are introducing, say, edicts through it being programmable, then ultimately it's to maintain the demand center, but then to obviously to contour it in reference to edicts from on high. And so ultimately you don't have it, you can't have any agency, all right, through if you're beholden to edicts. And so the touchstone for that is the pandemic and the way how the biopolitical nature of the vaccines and the way how that you're accredited, you're given access to social life if you adhered to that. So if through, say, the development of central bank digital currencies and the credit instrument that you're given as you're going to be restructured, then you're looking at ultimately you're already in a state of redundancy and yet you don't know how that occurs. You're an interchangeable economic unit. So we can say that the cost of living as a credit instrument is what is a way to maintain your status. What would be the cost of living can be looked at in this way is just a maintenance level. So if you're credited the agency of want or demand, then what the cost of living is obviously in reference to that. And so we can read the development of subsistence and AI to connect them together. And the reason why, say, universal basic income becomes a thing now. Because if you're looking at the cost of living is in reference to subsistence, why is that? Well, if you're replacing people's jobs, which is not replacing people's jobs, but is replacing the economic activity of redundancy, so the way how that you create economic activity in order to seek rents from people or to monetize their aspirations. Well, do you need that when AI comes along, takes people's jobs, and so through taking their jobs makes the consumer redundant? You can understand that if the consumer becomes redundant, then demand obviously works back to a subsistence level. You don't have to sell people on life the way how it's given for them to have the aspirations towards life when obviously a machine is doing that. And so you can look at it in a way that you have a system that can have a subsistence level, and so their cost of living is in reference to subsistence. But that's designed because you don't need the aspirations, you don't need that economic multiplier, because obviously the development, what they set in train, what's set out as your destiny is for you're already in a state of redundancy, and so therefore you work on the aspiration for life. You're removing the necessity for the way how people need to invest in life, because you're trying to work it back to a subsistence level. Because if the economic system is changing, it doesn't require the investment in the principal asset of the consumer. And so therefore, if the consumer is an asset, is being an asset has to be restructured. So it becomes, everything is both asset and liability. It's always, they're both, right? They're never one or the other. It's like, we're the life's ultimate creditors and we are life's ultimate debtors as well. So, why? Because existential arbitrage. Arbitrage is that you've got the balance, and so you've got your scenario of you're trying to seek a balance for your life. But the balance is in reference to the excluded middle or the absence of creativity, because you're given as a demand center. And so that's why you can connect everything in our paradigm in reference to that principal trade. Because if you don't, then you won't understand the way how they become interchangeable. Asset and or liability becomes one and the same thing. It just depends on which side you're looking at it. But if you know that you are investing in the asset of the consumer, well, once again, if it comes up to a threshold moment where the economic system does not need the redundant activity, all right, that's maybe perpetuated the economy, that has maintained the economy for decades prior, then you can understand that universal basic income is provided for a subsistence level, and ultimately AI come and does makes redundant the consumer, and so therefore there's the necessity of generating a return on the investment that you make in the consumer is not needed. And so here you have the scenario where AI and central bank digital currencies are the way how that you can program credit to then restrict, well, ultimately your ability to demand, because there will be certain edicts that you'll have to adhere to, is ultimately seeking to restructure you as a credit instrument. And so once again, you take that and then you relate it to the cost of living as a credit instrument. So if the cost of living is only in reference to goods and services, or the way how life's given as a buyer's journey, then you obviously, through that orientation, discount the cost associated with your economizing actions and how you can only ever demand. Why are you only ever credited that you didn't? Why don't you credit yourself with the creation of the world that you create with other people? Why is that? It's quite strange. Why? Because you only see life marginally through an interest. So the marginality of your time is what frames your the orientation, or the what you can do. Because what you can do is in reference to your life, but through what you do, you produce the consumer that is always transcendent. And so therefore, the opportunity cost of your economizing actions is a creativity that you outsource. And if you're outsourcing creativity, you're outsourcing it to the very parasites that's going to restructure you. Hence, you're already in a state of redundancy, and they're just going to make that explicit. This is what is set out for you. So you can either maintain yourself, the marginal self, as a site of expiation or as a demand center, or you have to animate something beyond that totalizing claim, or animate an agency that you're not credited when you seek a return for your actions and not the perennial wellspring. I mean, it's an either or scenario, unfortunately, here. You're going to have to make a fucking choice. And so that, so we can look at it through, and this follows the risk-free proposition. So the risk-free proposition of existential arbitrage is the way how that we externalize the totalizing risk, because we don't venture anything beyond the inherent conservatism when we're always seeking a return for our actions and everybody's doing the same thing. To venture beyond the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey is to take a step into the unknown. And so therefore, if you're taking a step into the unknown, then ultimately how can you potentialize the bequeathal of a world if nobody's going to share that journey? So this is the difference. So, if life is, a risk-free proposition, it's because of the values. It's because of the way how that we invest in values that is substantiated by the lack of agency. We don't ultimately credit ourselves with creativity, so there's a disavow. And so you could say that the necessity of values is predicated upon an existential lack through our way of life, or our religiosity, we could say. And so therefore the cost of living is in spite of the self that you would otherwise overcome. And so therefore that's where you risk the self beyond obviously your redundancy. Now you can only do that if you do it as a people, because you share the same existential status, every single fucking one of you. And so therefore if you don't understand that you're working off the lowest common denominator, then ultimately you have to work in concert with each other to potentialize what would be a bequeathal or a way of life beyond what is otherwise set out for you, or what is otherwise held out as a fait accompli, whereby you become a victim of that disavow, because ultimately somebody's going to take responsibility for you and then obviously restructure you in reference to what they think is the way how life should be. And so we can look at this, and you get a glimpse of this through that ultimately the consumer is failing, all right? And so it's never framed this way, but once again, if the cost of living is in reference to the aspiration or lifestyle, and so what it's doing, it's working back, then it's bringing you right back to a subsistence level. And so therefore that is ultimately going to make people reflect upon their plight in a way where they otherwise wouldn't. Okay, and so therefore through that reduction or through that compression or that stress, we could say, then the catalyst for change becomes even greater, because if you're having all these confluence of, say, particular ideas, so you're looking at AI, the question of credit, like even what's occurring geopolitically as well, it's all kind of getting compressed to the question not of power but of you. All right, because ultimately you, as I said, that you are the system's creditor and debitor. You are both simultaneously. And so if you understand that you through the goodwill that you extend, you allow credit to become the means of exchange, you have to realize that that is the primary thing, that you're investing in your redundancy. You are giving credit to people. And so as soon as you start to take that back and realize that you have a power to animate what is without origination, or to create beyond the totalizing claim of a buyer's journey, then ultimately you will not invest in your own redundancy. And to invest in your own redundancy is obviously to look at the cost of your economizing actions in reference to it, and ultimately the way how that you get sold not to see where you are. So if you think that, and so this is where the nature of our command economy will become explicit. So I've talked about that if we do not have a choice on the way how time's given to us, then we're beholden to ultimately a command economy. We're commanded to produce ourselves as the credit instruments that we're given as. So what do you think will happen when central bank digital currencies make that explicit, that you are a credit instrument, you are a demand center? So any of the ways that was used to contour you to an end that say that this that our world, say, holds out, parasites hold out for you, well, now that's going to become more explicit, because you're dealing with the question of the redundancy of the form of life of the consumer, maybe through the development of AI, and why there's the necessity to actually for authoritarianism to become more explicit. But if you don't connect the authoritarianism that is ultimately we can see in the West is inextricably connected to the command that you are commanded to produce yourself as the credit instrument that you're given as, then what you won't understand is that latent authoritarianism is always there within our way of life. And that's why the necessity of questioning whether or not we have a choice on the way how time's given to us is principle. Because then you're looking at your cost of living beyond the minimum viable human that you are, or a subsistence level. So that's ultimately, that subsistence level necessitates universal basic income, but that credit obviously is in reference just as a maintenance. It's not based upon social mobility, because you don't need to sell the transcendence of social mobility when there's no spiritual aspiration in reference to an economic multiplier that is required. And so what happens that through money becoming programmable, it's ultimately going to restructure you. And so we could say that the ultimate war is a spiritual war, because you're dealing with questions of spirituality, and in turn through that you're dealing with the question of credit. And the credit has got nothing to do with money, but it's got to do with the credit instrument that you're given as. And so therefore, if you cannot see that the question of the cost of living is in reference to the credit instrument that you're given as, then you'll never see the opportunity cost of your actions, or the fact that you do have a choice in the way how time's given to you. And that's what we're exploring.